Y nosotros contentos, pues, porque en definitiva el pueblo venezolano elige al presidente de Venezuela.
Yo soy negra y pobre, como esclava más nunca.
We need very bad, so bad. And we need freedom with Guaido.
3, 2, 1.
Well, we actually invited ourselves and paid for ourselves, but decided to go really because of the deteriorating situation in Venezuela and the appalling decision of the Irish government to recognise Juan Guaido against all international law and historical precedent, which to us was an incredibly dangerous precedent. And given the way in which the situation in Venezuela was being covered in the West, we said, right, let's go and see things for ourselves. Now, as it happened, the visit coincided with an International People's Assembly that had been organised a year or two before by the Venezuelan government with community groups, trade unionists, all that type of Venezuelan support groups. As it turned out, because it coincided with the, I suppose, deteriorating political situation, attendance was down at that, but there were about 500 international visitors at that. So we got a couple of days at that event, but it wasn't a government-sponsored trip or anything like that. We made particular efforts to talk to people from the broadest spectrum possible, affluent people and poorer people in the barrios as well. Very easy. I mean, the idea that this is a dictatorship is absolute and utter nonsense. I mean, and on some of the walls there was death to Maduro. Plenty of people were given out about the government and could freely do so. And people were very politically conscious, very politically aware. The biggest problem was language, obviously, so we had to sometimes have translators, and we brought translators with us. Like, for example, one of the translators at the conference came with us and translated privately. So yeah, if people want to talk, they're happy to talk. Everybody has an opinion, and the idea that this is a 50-50 split is utter nonsense. There's loads of people who give out about the government. We actually thought we were at home, there was so many of them, but actually more people dislike the opposition. And when the West talks about the opposition, they talk about Juan Guaido, but that's just a totally simplistic analysis. Nobody in Venezuela talks about Juan Guaido. There is an opposition. Some of it is a right-wing opposition, of which Juan Guaido is a minority. But there's also a left opposition, a load of people who think the government haven't gone far enough to help ordinary people.
Porque te da participación activa, porque tú pasas por un proceso de participación activa donde tú realmente construyes tu destino. Claro que no es fácil. Hay gente que se niega a transferirle el poder al pueblo.
So, like, one of the days on the conference, they organised a trip for us to go to one of the barrios to look at some of the projects that they've been involved in. Ironically, the first time when we pulled up in this place, it was a community radio station. It was one of the ones that stayed open during the Chavez coup, the only one, and they got an award for that, but it was at the bottom of a big apartment block. And as soon as we arrived and one of the residents saw that we were there and we were kind of with the government, she started hurling abuse down from about the 15th floor, and the translation was basically that she'd been on to the council looking for something to be fixed and it wasn't done. So, and again, freely able to do that, nobody batted an eyelid, but they took us to different places. And a number of different people would say things. There were communal projects, there were areas of land which had been reclaimed with the help of the government, maybe old factory buildings and so on, where there were cooperatives. Some people would give out that they hadn't been financed enough by the government. Others were just happy to get along with it. Other people would say, look, I don't care about the government, but we're not going to sacrifice the revolution. We want to run our projects here. We want to make bread, or there were projects to redevelop herbal medicine, all that sort of stuff. So yeah, I mean, a lot of different opinions. I suppose some people would see a difference between Chavismo and support for the government. So, you know, they would say they want the gains of the revolution or whatever. There's been a lot of social progress, even though life is very difficult as well. In fairness, we were impressed, I suppose, at a number of quite wealthy people that we met that were, I suppose, supportive of the government is the wrong word. They were actually quite critical of the government, that they hadn't done enough, if you like, to invest the oil revenue, to develop indigenous industry or agriculture and so on, but they weren't absolutely not in favour of Guaido, and they weren't in favour of US intervention. Very, very conscious of their history in that regard. So it was interesting in that way. So that would be even some of the wealthy people. When you go into East Caracas and that, I suppose even talking to some people there, they were of that view. But generally speaking, yes, the people who support Juan Guaido, and they're a tiny minority, I mean, they're negligible. You come home and you think that this fella it's a 50-50 split and everyone knows him. But as somebody said, I think he's only ever got about 16,000 votes, which is kind of near, I've nearly got that myself, like, and he's supposed to be the president of a country. 35-year-old young fella who was trained by the CIA, like but people don't, they really don't see him. Now there is other right-wing opposition who are more credible, less violent than he is, more credible. And a lot of people, even wealthy people, wouldn't like the way they are calling for more sanctions. And certainly the idea of military intervention has lessened his support. But a lot of the poorer people then would, at the end of the day, support the government. And maybe some of the poorest people in some ways support the government the most, because they're the people who, let's face it, 2.5 million houses since 2015. That's an incredible achievement, you know. Education, the health centres, helping people reclaim areas of land. So people might moan a little bit that they're not getting a bit more help in that, but they're a lot better off than they were. And even in these difficult days, the poorest people get a box of basic food essentials every month. There are subsidised shops there, and they get a top up on their salary. It's really the people who are, I suppose, who were on the $100 a month, living comfortably in the more middle income jobs, who've been hit the most, because the value of the bolivar has just absolutely crashed. So people early in the year, it was 730 bolivars to $1. That's gone to 3,300. So you're carrying, nobody can even get access to cash. So their wages have just diminished overnight. That sounds catastrophic, and it is catastrophic, but you got to remember as well, electricity is basically free, water, transport, petrol, you know, accommodation, all those things are kind of free. So it's not that there's no food there, there's plenty of food there and people can access it, but there is a difficulty with money and queuing and that kind of stuff. You do have to register. You have to register to get the package, but you can vote for who you like and all the rest. You just have to, register to get it, but absolutely not. We've had plenty of people who got it who weren't going, oh, we love the government or anything, And I think millions of people get this and are happy to get it, It was interesting, we were on one, people think there's a humanitarian crisis. There isn't a humanitarian crisis. There's an economic crisis brought on largely because of the sanctions and the intervention. But there was a big festival and big carnival on while we were there. And one woman, we were just standing kind of watching it, and an elderly woman came up to me on purpose with her little shopping trolley and opened it in front of me to show me, like, there was loads of food in it, like, and it was stuff like that. So they're kind of aware of the way in which it's being portrayed externally. It's not like that, like, But life is difficult too, like, in terms of, and obviously particularly now with the sabotage on the electrics and the idea of people not being able to get the metro, people being stranded miles and miles and miles away from where they work and where they live, and that's hugely problematic and will be causing a lot of stress for people. But they don't necessarily blame the government for that. They do a bit, but not exclusively. A lot of people would blame it on either direct sabotage or, at the very best, I suppose, the starving of the resources of Venezuela and not being able to access key parts and trade properly. And develop, repair the infrastructure that's there. Obviously, some people would blame the government as well, and some blame does rest with the government for failing to adequately invest in the infrastructure when the oil prices were high. There's no question this isn't a perfect government, but the other side, where find me one that is, like, but and people would give out about that, but not to the point that they're going to allow military intervention as a solution, and they don't see that. We saw zero support for intervention. We met people who'd been on the border with Colombia the couple of days beforehand, young men who train every week. They're very well armed. They said there's plenty of Russian weaponry in there. They do military training at the weekends, and they are prepared to defend the country if necessary. And we said, well, how many of you is there? Well, there's about 1 million in the reserves and in the people's militia. And we said, right, and why would people do this? They said, well, because we can't really trust the army, like you said, you know. And there would be a lot of criticism of the government. There's an awareness that there's mismanagement, that there's abuse of the natural resources, like through, you know, those the army and people in the political establishment. Absolutely, and people would be conscious of that, but they don't want the Americans coming in. Like, they're really conscious of Latin American history. So we didn't actually see any support for interventionism. A little bit, you know, a little bit, some people saying, well, what could be worse in some ways? But obviously, most people say a lot of things could be a lot worse than this. We have to be very careful. So I think the support for Guaido is actually very limited. Now, that doesn't mean there is a right-wing opposition there, but most of the others would agree to talk and dialogue, and there was talks and dialogue, and the government is calling for talks and dialogue, and I think that's where we've got to get back to. And the EU made a mistake in jumping in behind the US and recognising Guaido, because whatever about, it's absolutely true that Maduro, a lot of people don't like him, but they do like Chavismo, but they know that the government has mismanaged. Now, he doesn't have the charisma that Chavez had, but that doesn't mean they're going to support Guaido. Absolutely, and they certainly aren't. So they're now trying to lean on the Russians, on the Chinese, and on the support that they have, you know, from Cuba and so on, whereas they actually should be going way further. There's loads of people, ordinary people in South America, even in the countries that have, I suppose, gone to the right, who don't like interventionism and who would support the people of Venezuela. There's a lot of people in Europe, and the Venezuelan government haven't gone and made links there in the way in which they should. So we would be critical of them, most definitely, for that. So having the army there gives them a certain backing, but it's the reason why the army backed them is, yes, partly because key figures in the army are, say, the Minister for Revenue and the Minister for Oil, and that helps them, but also because they know the people primarily back the government, that the poorest people's living standards have been raised, and while there are difficulties, the bulk of the people still do support Maduro. So he's there, kind of a combination of both. It is interesting to see some of those who left and, you know, left the country and who were in the army, who are speaking out now against the government, the irony there. And I think many people in Venezuela would realise that it's there amongst some of the people who pilfered the most, who happily worked for the government under Chavez and under Maduro and benefited hugely, personally, financially, from the situation as well. So I suppose a bit like the way people here, I mean, they realise that a lot of the army are corrupt and that, but they're kind of willing to tolerate it is an overstatement. That's not the case, but they kind of say, well, you know, a bit begrudging sort of acceptance of it. The EU have 100% backed the wrong horse. There is no circumstances on earth on which Guaido will come to power in Venezuela unless he's imposed externally as a dictator. 100%. I think there's a realisation now, because subsequent to our visit, and it's quite clear now that a bit of a stalemate has developed. The strategy was a quick push around that weekend with the delivery of the humanitarian aid. That absolutely fell flat on its face, and now they don't really know what to do. They have this mock sort of Guaido going around the country to rally support. No one really knows what he's doing. The crowds are very small turning out for him, and things are just being organised really internationally. So people, I mean, we were at a meeting which Maduro addressed. He slated the EU, was absolutely scathing in his condemnation of their role in it, and indeed of obviously the Colombians and that as well. He was particularly scathing of them. I think people's attitude is that there were talks going on. There had been talks facilitated by the Vatican, by the Spanish government, which everybody was sitting around talking. And Guaido's crowd, at the behest of the Americans, won't talk and won't participate, went externally. So everybody needs to be gotten around the table, and that was the message. They don't want interventionism. They want the right to be able to run their economy properly, so they need the sanctions and that interference lifted so that they can get the medicines, so that they need access to their own assets internationally, which actually are being robbed and given to the other side. They need a breathing space. So that's what they want. They want the message being no military intervention, no sanctions, and they want the EU or whoever to facilitate dialogue with all the parties there to get out of the impasse that's there. And I think that's doable. But it needs, you know, I suppose there are people in the EU and certainly in America whose faces need to be saved in this arrangement as well. And if that has to be done to bring peace, fine. But Guaido will not be part of a peaceful solution, absolutely not. It's supposed to be a neutral country, but you know, to kind of claim some independence we could. I mean, for example, they put out quite a good statement in relation to Trump's nonsense over the Golan Heights. So they can, you know, take contrary positions if they like. And the EU can be important because it's very difficult for the United States to do things without the blessing of at least a number of players in the EU. And Ireland can be part of speaking out against what's going on. I get the impression we did have a discussion with Simon Coveney upon return. Get the impression that there's a realisation probably in the EU that Guaido is maybe not as he was portrayed, that this isn't going to be a sort of it's not a quick fix 50-50 solution or anything. I think the EU would be 100% against military intervention. I think we can champion that cause, but we need to get them to a place where they're facilitating dialogue. And I think that's doable. All that's been asked for here is to respect international law. And actually the affluent legal people that we met who were there said, anybody, even people in the opposition, will tell you what's gone on here is illegal in international law and in Venezuelan law. And if you accept that precedent, and there's loads of people, right-wing people and conservative people, who want to respect the rule of law, because if you don't, where does that lead you? And it's leading Venezuela into a situation where their national assets are being frozen abroad and basically stolen from the people there. And that, if it can happen to them, sure, it can happen to any country. So I think the EU know something, they know it's gone a little bit, you know, but whether they're prepared to care enough to stand up to the US, whether the Russians and the Chinese, their investment in the place is enough for them to kind of play a role. Will they just say, you know, leave it to the United States? I don't know. But in that context, I do think the role of the EU is important, and Ireland can play a role in pushing them. Nobody knows what's going to happen next. I'd be very concerned at the worsening stranglehold through the sabotage of the electricity and vital infrastructure. That's going to have a hugely demoralising effect on the population and make life incredibly difficult. So that needs to be addressed urgently. We would argue that that should be done, and the EU and others should push in a humanitarian way to address some of that crisis. Politically, there needs to be an intervention externally. Where it's going to come from, I'm not sure. The EU could be a broker in that. The Vatican could be and was, but interestingly, there's a push from the United States and from Guaido's people to actually attack the Vatican to prevent talks. If we can get into talks, then the situation can be saved, as it were, and a space can be provided where the Venezuelan government and members of the opposition, or most of the opposition, I don't see Guaido's crowd participating in that, and they haven't, but other people in the opposition, including people who would be, you know, pro-American but not pro-selling Venezuela to trade with America and that kind of thing, they need to be given the space to sit around, probably to facilitate new elections in maybe, you know, the next year, and then maybe a presidential election the year after, or something like that, in a calmer space where you pull the economy back a bit. But that's the best case scenario. The rest is a civil war. The rest is Guaido's people getting resources, funding mercenaries on the border with Colombia, coming in, killing people, destabilising the economy and laying the basis for more or less a civil war and a horror scene for people there.